Hello everyone. I'll take you to Venice tonight. On this table we have various items from Venice that shed light on its history, and also copies of paintings from some of the most famous Venetian painters. I'm going to tell you a little bit about these objects and how they are connected to aspects of the history of Venice. And we will also take a look at these paintings to examine how they are constructed and why they were so innovative and remarkable when they were created. So, to begin with, we have various Venetian masks. These are not very ancient. I bought them about 15 years ago. But they were made using exactly the same technique that was already in use during the Middle Age. They are made of various layers of paper. The craftsmen who made and still make these masks start with the sculpture of a face in 3 dimensions, generally made of clay. Then they cover the sculpture with plaster, and once the plaster is dry, they have a print, a mold of the face. They fill in the mold with paper sheets, wet with a mix of water and glue. And when the various layers are dry, the paper mask can be separated from the mold and decorated. This material is rather resistant and at the same time flexible. As long as they are kept in a dry place, they age very well. Now look at all the details. They all have a different expression on their face because they come from different molds. And this type of decoration with golden leaves and various colors was already very popular in Venice in the 18th century. And the 18th century was the golden age of the Venice Carnival. But what is it exactly, this carnival that Venice celebrated every year? You know that the carnivals are a festive period in many Western countries with a Christian tradition. Every year there is a period called Lent, during which the faithfuls are supposed to restrain themselves, especially from the richest sorts of food, but it's not only food, it is an invitation to abandon, temporarily, things that they find pleasurable, but that are unrelated to religion. Before Lent, in most Western countries, appeared a tradition that was in the Middle Age to celebrate a short period of excess before Lent. Excess meant an abundance of food. You know that in the Middle Age the supply of food was a constant worry in many countries, so that's allowing a short period with less ordinary and more precious foods like meat or even sugar was a little luxury that came back every year. Actually, this is also exactly the origin of Mardi Gras, which literally means Fat Tuesday. It is the day before Ash Wednesday, when Lent begins. In some Catholic and Orthodox countries as well, the celebration started to extend to various days prior to the beginning of Lent, and this became the carnivals, a several days long period when excess was tolerated and even organized. And it was not limited to food, it also extended to social norms too. There were parties in the streets, parades, people would wear costumes, and through costuming, social roles could be inverted temporarily. Poor people would wear costumes of wealthier social classes, and vice versa, so that they could experiment for a while a feel of what another social position would be. Now in Venice, the Carnival started in the Middle Age, like in many other European cities, but over time it took epic proportions and it contributed to shape the city's image. Venice was at its peak in wealth and power by the end of the Middle Age, because it had achieved to become the main trade hub between Europe and the Middle East. All trade in spices, a lot of gold and other precious metals, sugar, precious fabrics like silk coming from China. All of this transited through Venice, and the Republic of Venice had a military and a navy to match its wealth and defend the trade routes from Greece, the Black Sea, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, that all converged towards Venice. But this position started to erode from the 15th century onwards. First because the Ottomans cut or reoriented trade routes to their benefit as they progressively controlled the Middle East. And then the Portuguese explorers found the route to Asia by sea, by sailing south of Africa, and they started to bring all these products, especially spices, directly to Europe. This made Venice much less relevant than it used to be, so that the Republic declined economically and militarily through the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. To a certain extent, Venice managed to reinvent itself. I'll tell you about that later. And this slowed down the decline. But it was not enough, and the Republic increasingly turned into the shadow of what it used to be. And returning to the Carnival, as the city declined, the Carnival grew more and more in importance and became an eagerly expected distraction, a way for the city to celebrate itself without thinking too much about what it had lost. By the 18th century, the Carnival lasted up to 6 months per year. And many of the images that come to mind about Venice today, like the parties, music, culture, masks, wigs, are from the 18th century. In the last century of its independence, Venice was partying for half of the year, and aristocrats from all over Europe enjoyed going to Venice to participate in this. Now we have to imagine what it meant for people who could hide their identity for half of the year, with no need to talk to people they knew when they were in disguise, and a sense of liberty given by anonymity. This must have created a weird kind of atmosphere, almost surreal. So it's been a long road for Venice, from a tough republic of merchants who were opening trade routes with the East and often fighting for it, to a capital of pleasure. But the decline didn't happen without a fight, and these two items are an illustration of it. This is Murano glass. Venice was not just a trade hub, it was also a manufacturing center for luxury goods, and this role grew in importance after the commercial decline began, and it made up for it to a certain extent. The production of glass in Venice was concentrated on the island of Murano since the Middle Age, and for several centuries Murano was the biggest glassmaking center in Europe, and many innovations came from there. For example, in the 15th century, they came up with a glass called Cristallo, which was perfectly transparent. They also invented a white glass that looked almost like porcelain, and that could replace it. And Murano was also the biggest producer of mirrors for a long time, when mirrors were precious goods and needed a layer of mercury to reflect images. And manufacturing was not limited to glass. This little cushion, covered in silk, was the kind of precious fabrics that were made in Venice and exported. In fact, long after the loss of its commercial monopoly, Venice stayed industrious, and it also developed agriculture in the zone on the continent that was under its control. The traditions of the Carnival and Murano glass had a revival in the 20th century after they had almost disappeared. They are centered around tourism now. The Carnival was relaunched in 1980, and maybe it can come across as a bit fake because it is just a celebration of something that has lost its reason to be, apart from tourism. But even with the crowds and bad restaurants and cheap souvenirs, Venice is so beautiful and evocative, at least to me, that the magic keeps working. But there is even more to the decline of Venice, because in its long period of decay, it also became an incredible center for arts in general, especially painting. There were two periods of greatness for Venetian painting. One was in the Renaissance during the 16th century, and it didn't come out of nowhere. Venice already had painters in the Middle Age, and it was also a consequence of the wealth accumulated by merchant families. They could become patrons of the arts, they could make donations to churches for their construction or their decoration, and even the state was rich enough to place many orders. This provided an economic basis for art creation on a large scale, and masters had a workshop with aides and apprentices, and they could accept orders from all over Europe. Now, in the history of painting, the Renaissance is a turning point for the status of artists. You have probably never heard of a particular painter from the Middle Age or even the Antiquity. This is because they were not recognized as artists with an individuality that should be expressed through their work. They could be appreciated and praised, but they were always considered as gifted craftsmen. Most of medieval painting was religious, and the clients could be princes or religious authorities, often to decorate a church or a cathedral. They would define a theme, validate an initial drawing, and then the painter or the painters who worked on it were expected to follow precisely the instructions they had been given. It doesn't mean their work could not be personal, but it was never recognized as such. They would not sign their works, for example. But starting in Italy, in the 15th century, this status began to change, and painters started to be recognized for themselves, for the creativity, the innovation, the touch they could bring. Actually, this is the birth of the artist in the modern sense, an individual with a particular vision and a particular technique. The Venetian school participated fully in this. Its famous painters still worked based on orders, but they sometimes created their own works out of any necessity and eventually sold them. Even when they worked for clients, they were expected to add their personal touch and cultural references or symbols that had not been explicitly required. Successful painters, like the ones we're going to talk about, worked like a small business with their team. Typically, the master would paint the most delicate parts, like faces or hands, and also control the general composition of a particular work, because sometimes they could be gigantic. Among masters of the Renaissance in Venice, 3 names stand out, but there were many more, and these names are Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese. Maybe the most successful of them was Titian. Titian was a superstar of painting during his life and in all of Europe. Titian is particularly famous for his portraits. He was able to give his subjects a very distinct character. Another thing he excelled at was using the texture of the canvas and of paint itself. Instead of just applying color inside a drawing, he added effects with volume and sometimes applying paint directly with his fingers. It is never abstract painting, it always remains figurative, but this technique adds a vibrant quality to his works. Since the Renaissance in painting, there has been 2 approaches: a priority to drawing with clean lines, or a more blurred, for lack of a better word, use of colors to suggest shapes. One is not better than the other, and depending on the period or fashion, one of these approaches was dominant. Medieval painting, for example, was very much based on lines. But with the Renaissance and many painters from the 17th century after that, like Rembrandt, color gained ground until the mid-18th century. And then arrived neoclassical painting, like the works of David or Ingres, which are a return to very clean, well-defined lines in painting. Finally, in the 19th century, academic painting remained based on drawing, on the rules of neoclassical style, but it was finally overthrown by romantic painters like Turner or Delacroix, and finally drawing lost completely with the Impressionists and the complete disappearance of lines. This is one of Titian's most famous portraits. It's called Woman with a Mirror. The woman with light skin tone and colorful clothes clearly stands out on a dark background. But a lot happens in the background too. There is a man holding 2 mirrors, his face and arms coming out of darkness with subtlety. And if you look at the hair or the way the fabric shines, you have a perfect example of color dominating over drawn lines. Seen from close, it is only a juxtaposition of shiny colors. But from far, with a bit more distance, it looks perfectly realistic, and the use of color gives a particular vibrance to the picture. When Titian painted this was groundbreaking, and it solidified his reputation as a master. Now this is a work by Tintoretto. He was nicknamed Il Furioso, the Furious One, because he was remarkable for his energy in painting and the use of dramatic perspectives and gestures. Like Titian, he has a distinctive style, but he follows the principles of the Venetian school during the Renaissance, with brushwork that uses touches of color to suggest textures, the effects of light, and even emotions. One of his famous and latest work is The Last Supper. A few decades before him, Da Vinci painted the same subject, and it is a completely different treatment. The entire scene, made by Da Vinci, is symmetrical, seen from the front, and it transmits a sense of peace and harmony. Tintoretto's version is just the opposite of this. The angle is very unusual. There are no clear verticals or horizontal lines to stabilize the picture, which gives it a chaotic feel. And it looks much more lively and dramatic, with halos of light that come out of the obscurity. And the light in this scene comes from within. There is no external source of light. Other painters were exploring the same direction at the same time, but this painting could not have existed a few decades before, with this way of trying to inject emotions and extreme feelings inside a painting. The other name I mentioned earlier was Veronese, and he was renowned for very large format mythology or religion paintings. One of his masterworks is The Wedding Feast at Cana, which is an enormous 7 by 10 meters painting where all characters are represented almost at human size. The painting is at the Louvre Museum today, and in case you go, you need to see it because this is an experience. It is so large that it absorbs you. And imagine the impact it could have on people from the 16th century who were not saturated with images as we are. The painting is very busy with characters and ornaments. It is also simple in its composition. There is no weird angle. It is straight from the front, with a degree of symmetry that helps immediately understand the general balance and creates a sense of harmony. There is movement everywhere, and it is realistic in proportion and style, but the scene is not. No wedding, and especially in the 1st century AD, could look like this, with antique monuments, Renaissance buildings, and people dressed in what looks like Renaissance clothes. This is not really an attempt at recreating an accurate historical scene, but rather at imagining an ideal world where colors are vibrant, the sun always shines, and there is a general sense of perfection. What also stands out is the exaggerated attitude of characters in the painting. Like in Tintoretto's work, this is characteristic from the late Renaissance, and this style of painting with the intention to suggest emotion and transmit liveliness through exaggerated features is called Mannerism. So, Venetian painting experienced a golden age in the 16th century, and then the centers of innovation and success moved north to Flanders, to the Netherlands in the 17th century, or to France and other parts of Italy. But it was not over yet, because after a period of eclipse, the Venetian school returned to the light in the 18th century with a completely different approach. The new stars of painting are now Tiepolo or Canaletto, and the city of Venice itself is at the center of their creation for many of them. As we said before, Venice in the 18th century is now really and obviously decadent. It spends half of the year celebrating its Carnival, and wealthy tourists, aristocrats from Europe, enjoy paying a visit. Venice in the 18th century has never looked that good. It has almost taken the appearance we know today, with palaces, fountains, churches from different centuries, canals, and beautiful bridges everywhere. The city looks like a place out of time and has become highly picturesque. So Venetian painters take advantage of this, and they develop a style based on views from Venice, made with technical excellence and realism. Many of these painters are very successful everywhere in Europe. They sell in France, in the UK, in Germany, in Austria, in Italy. And they develop a particular taste for the perfect view. Sometimes they even tweak the rules of perspective and reality to provide a more aesthetical result. Look at this view of St. Mark's Square by Canaletto, with St. Mark's Basilica at the center. At first sight, it looks perfectly realistic, but this picture is actually recreated with different views. If you follow the perspective lines given by the buildings on each side, they converge to two different points on each side of the basilica. So in fact, he's been combining three different angles to create this picture and give the basilica way more space than it should have, just to make the image more majestic and satisfying to the eye. Giambattista Tiepolo was another famous painter from this Venetian revival in the 18th century, but with a different style. He didn't specialize in views of Venice, and his style is very ornate and decorative, and he worked a lot on frescoes for churches and palaces. The remarkable thing about his style that fueled his success was the luminosity. His paintings are bright and almost have an ethereal quality to them. They almost look like solid light or light taking shapes among the clouds sometimes. This one is Rinaldo Enchanted by Armida, painted by Tiepolo, and it looks completely dreamy, highly decorated and exuberant. With this last painting, we conclude our video for today. I hope you liked it, and as always, your opinions in the comment section and your ideas for new topics are very welcome. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Au revoir.